The photograph had to be perfectly parallel with the edge of the nightstand. I nudged the worn cardboard a single millimeter to the left, my knuckle brushing the cold steel, and the world felt fractionally more stable. My wife and son smiled from behind the plastic film, their expressions frozen in a past that felt like someone else's history, a life I had observed but never truly lived. The only other object on the stand was my old copy of Behavioral Pathologies, its spine broken and its pages filled with my own rigid annotations. Those two items were the last remaining pillars of my identity, a family man and a doctor, and I polished them like holy relics every morning. This was the day the world ended, though it began like any other Tuesday inside the walls of Blackwood Peak Psychiatric. I remember the smell of antiseptic fighting, a losing battle against the scent of stale air and human despair. I remember the specific drone from the fluorescent lights overhead, a constant electronic sound that burrowed into your skull. The memory of that sound is sharp because its absence would soon become the first signal of the great unraveling. Ivan Ute, the head orderly, made his morning rounds, his bulk moving with a cynical weariness that 30 years in this place had ground into his bones. He glanced into my cell, his weathered Inuk face a mask of indifference, and the collection of keys on his belt chimed a discordant tune. He saw me as just another patient, the brilliant doctor who flew too close to the sun and got his wings melted, a story he had seen play out a dozen times before. I stepped out into the common room for my allotted hour, the gray scrubs I wore a constant, galling reminder of my status. My goal was always the same, to impose some fragment of my old clinical authority on the chaos of the ward. I tried to engage a catatonic man by asking him about his routine, a therapeutic technique to ground him in the present, but he just stared through me. It was a performance for myself, an attempt to prove I was still Dr. Dixon, but my audience was not convinced. Across the room, Wes North was playing chess against himself, his shaved head bent in concentration. His institutional uniform was spotless, an island of meticulous order in the general decay of the facility. I approached his table, drawn to the intellectual challenge he represented, the one system in this building I still believed I could analyze and understand. He moved a black pawn with a fluid grace, then shifted in his seat to contemplate the board from the white side. An unusual opening for black, I remarked, my voice sounding more academic than I felt. He looked up, and his dark eyes were completely calm, holding an unnerving stillness. He studied my face for a moment before his gaze returned to the board. He reached out with a slender hand, picked up his white queen, and laid it on its side in a gesture of surrender. Then he slid his black bishop forward, putting his own king in checkmate. Sometimes the winning move is to throw the whole game away, Doctor. He offered no further explanation, leaving me to grapple with the deliberate absurdity of the act. It was a message, a perfect summation of his philosophy, that the rules only bind those who agree to play. In a corner of the room, a thin, jittery young man named Tito Uwu was twisting a length of copper wire into a delicate spiral. He whispered to himself about frequencies and signal degradation, a brilliant engineering mind lost in a labyrinth of delusion. No one paid him any attention. He was just part of the noise. The storm arrived without ceremony. It had been gathering over the Catskills all morning, and the sky outside the reinforced windows had turned a bruised purple. The first clap of thunder was a physical blow that shook the building's concrete skeleton. The wind began to shriek, and rain lashed against the glass like thrown gravel. The lights flickered once, twice, and the low drone of the facility's power faltered. Ivan Ute cursed and started walking toward the staff station, his hand resting on the taser at his belt. Then came a flash of lightning so brilliant it bleached the world white for a second, followed instantly by a sound like the sky cracking open. The overhead lights exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. The emergency generator deep in the basement coughed to life with a strained groan, sputtered for 3 seconds, and then a final, catastrophic surge went through the building's wiring. A sharp smell of ozone filled the air. And then there was silence. Absolute, profound silence, followed by a single, resonant sound that echoed through the entire ward. It was the sound of 100 magnetic locks disengaging at once. Click. The social architecture of Blackwood Peak, the the invisible walls of steel and electricity that separated patient from staff, predator from prey, had just vanished. We were plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical substance. Panic erupted immediately, a wave of screams and confused shouts that washed over the common room. In the chaos, I heard a wet, tearing sound followed by a choked gurgle. A nurse screamed. The apocalypse did not arrive with a bang from the outside world, but with a quiet failure from within, a cancer of neglect and decay that had finally metastasized. An orderly I recognized, a man named Henderson who was a week from retirement, had been complaining of a fever all morning. He had collapsed in the dark. Now he was getting back up. He launched himself at the screaming nurse, and the sound of his teeth sinking into her throat was sickeningly clear in the blackness. My mind raced, trying to process the impossible sight illuminated by the emergency exit signs that now cast a hellish red glow over the scene. I tried to take command, my voice cracking as I shouted the old words, the useless incantations of a dead world. Everyone remain calm. We need to follow lockdown protocols. No one heard me. They were animals in a cage, blind and terrified. I was frozen, a theorist drowning in a sea of visceral horror. My entire life had been dedicated to the analysis of abnormal behavior, and now, confronted with the ultimate abnormality, I could not move. It was Wexo who acted. His voice cut through the shrieking, not loud but imbued with a chilling certainty. He pointed at two of the largest patients, men who usually spent their days shuffling in a medicated stupor. You two. The table. Barricade the main door. There's extra pudding at dinner for you. The promise was absurd, but his tone was not. They obeyed without question, heaving a heavy steel table against the common room doors as the groans of the newly dead grew louder from the hallway outside. Wexo then turned to another patient, a man with a history of violence. He pointed to the fire extinguisher on the wall. Henderson is sick. You need to help him. Use that to crush his skull. The man grabbed the extinguisher and did as he was told, bringing it down with a sickening crunch. Wexo watched the act with the detached curiosity of a researcher observing a lab rat. He then walked over to a shattered table, calmly broke off one of its steel legs, and pushed the makeshift club into my trembling hands. The metal was cold and heavy. The system has failed, Doctor, Wexo said, his face partially illuminated by the red light, splattered with Henderson's blood. Are you going to analyze the problem, or are you going to help me solve it? We were trapped. The hours that followed were a blur of fear and mounting desperation. The handful of survivors in the common room, a mix of patients and two terrified staff members, looked to me for answers I did not have. My authority was a ghost, a title with no power. The only thing keeping the dead in the hallway at bay was the flimsy barricade. Our only hope was the infirmary, which had medical supplies, stored food, and a reinforced corridor leading to the ground floor. It was a fortress within the prison, but it was on the other side of the hall. I knew then that my knowledge was worthless. My entire framework for understanding the world, for controlling it through diagnosis and procedure, had been rendered obsolete. Survival required a different kind of logic, a brutal calculus that was native to Wexo's mind, not mine. I found him sitting by the darkened television, watching the barricaded door as if expecting it to provide some entertainment. We need to get to the infirmary, I said, my voice low. I agree, Wexo replied without looking at me. But the hallway is compromised. What's your plan? The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I was no longer the doctor consulting a patient. I was a subordinate asking for orders. He finally turned to look at me, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. A plan requires a sacrifice, a distraction. His eyes drifted across the room and settled on a patient named Marcus, a man gripped by a severe paranoid delusion that another patient, a quiet man named Leo, was stealing his thoughts. Marcus believes Leo is a psychic thief, a threat. All he needs is a catalyst to act on that belief. I understood immediately what he was suggesting, to use Marcus's psychosis to aim his violent potential like a weapon. It was the very core of what had destroyed my career, the manipulation of a patient's illness, But this time, it was not for therapy. It was for survival. "No," I said, but the word was weak. "Think of it as a form of immersion." "Confrontation therapy, Doctor," Wexo said smoothly, using the name of my own disgraced method. "You will be forcing Marcus to confront his perceived antagonist. The resulting altercation will be loud. It will draw the attention of our new friends in the hall. It will give us the time we need to cross to the infirmary." He paused, letting the monstrous logic sink in. "It is the most rational course of action. Do you see a better one?" I looked at the others huddled in the corner, their faces pale with fear. I looked at the blood staining the floor. I thought of the photograph in my pocket, of the life I was desperate to reclaim. I was a man of rules, but the rules were gone. There was only the choice between an ugly survival and a pointless death. I walked over to Marcus, my heart pounding a sick rhythm against my ribs. I knelt beside him and began to speak, my voice a clinical whisper, planting the seeds of violent suggestion Wexo had given me. I was weaponizing madness, becoming the monster they had all accused me of being. This was my first compromise, the first time I chose the devil's solution. There would be no going back. "It's not a bite," the young nurse said, clutching her arm as we moved through the darkened west wing. The fabric of her scrubs was soaked with a dark stain that was not just blood. I could see the parallel teeth marks even in the poor light from Ivan's flashlight. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate plea for me to believe her lie. I was a doctor, and my first instinct was to care for the patient, to find the infirmary and get antibiotics, to clean the wound and tell her everything would be fine. Wes stopped beside me, his movements fluid and silent. He looked from her arm to my face with an expression of academic curiosity. "Infection is a clock, Doctor," he said, his voice a calm note in the tense quiet. "Sentimentality is a stone tied to your ankle when the water is rising. You can deal with this now, or I will." I hesitated, caught between the oath I had lived by and the reality that was unfolding around us. The nurse started to cry, her sobs echoing down the concrete hallway. Before I could form a response, Ivan moved. He was a solid shape of pragmatism. He grabbed the nurse by her good arm and pulled her toward a records room. She screamed and fought him, but he was too strong. He shoved her inside and slammed the heavy metal door, the lock clicking with a terrible finality. Her screams became muffled, a frantic pounding starting on the other side of the door. From farther down the hall, a new sound answered her, a low gurgling moan that was multiplying. The infected were coming. "Ivan's action just saved our lives," Wes noted, as if observing a laboratory rat successfully navigate a maze. "Your diagnosis was correct. She was infected. But your treatment plan was malpractice. Lesson 1. Save the group, not the individual." I was horrified, but he was right. We ran, leaving her screams and the approaching moans behind us. To get out of the facility, we needed weapons from the security armory, and Ivan was the only one who knew the way through the maintenance tunnels. He refused to help. He leaned against a wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest, and told me he blamed me for what Blackwood Peak had become. He said my therapies and my ambition had broken the institution's rules long before the world itself broke. I tried to reason with him, appealing to our shared need to survive, but his face was set like stone. Wes watched my failure with a patient smile. He stepped forward and spoke to Ivan, his tone conversational. He did not talk about the group or survival. He asked Ivan his daughter's name. Ivan's expression flickered. Wes had read his file, of course. He knew about the girl waiting for him in an isolated cabin. Wes did not threaten or plead. He offered Ivan a position. He said that once we were outside, Ivan's skills would make him the natural leader of our security, the man in charge of protecting us all on the road. Wes was not offering a shared goal. He was offering power, a tool Ivan could use to guarantee he would see his daughter again. Ivan thought for a moment, then nodded once. He led us to a service hatch hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. As we descended into the dark, narrow tunnels, Wes looked back at me. "Self-interest is the only reliable currency, Doctor. Altruism is a fiction for a world that no longer exists." The maintenance tunnels opened into a service corridor near the armory. Ivan picked the lock with practiced ease, and we armed ourselves with 4 handguns. The outer gates were our last obstacle. They were controlled by an electronic relay in a security booth, but a power surge had fried the panel. Sparks spit from a blackened circuit board. Tony was our only hope. He was a brilliant engineer, but he was lost in his own world, twisting a piece of wire in his hands and whispering to himself. I approached him cautiously, trying to use the calming techniques I had learned over 20 years of practice. I spoke in a low voice and suggested a breathing exercise. It had the opposite effect. He recoiled from me, his eyes wild, and started shouting about signal interference. He was a live wire, dangerous and useless. Wes stepped past me. "Did you ever read his file, Doctor?" he asked softly. He knelt in front of Tony, meeting his unfocused gaze. "The white noise sent a message," Wes said, his voice perfectly even. "The signal is trapped. You have to retune the gateway so we can receive the final broadcast." Tony stopped shaking. His eyes cleared with a sudden, terrifying purpose. He looked at the smoking relay panel as if it were a divine puzzle. He fell upon it, his hands moving with manic precision, stripping wires and rerouting circuits with scraps from the maintenance room. Minutes later, the panel sparked once and a green light blinked on. The heavy gates outside groaned open. Wes had not cured Tony's madness. He had validated it, aimed it, and turned it into a key. We found a maintenance van and drove out into the sunlight. The open road felt like a miracle. For a moment, seeing the empty highway winding through the green hills, I felt a surge of hope. I had a map, and I was plotting a course for Ithaca for my family. We passed through the town of Beacon and saw a pharmacy. The windows were intact. It looked safe. My old instincts took over. I decided we should try to trade some of the medications from the armory for food. It was an action based on trust and commerce, principles of the world I understood. The pharmacy was a trap. The moment we stepped inside, armed men from the Beacon Holdfast appeared from the back rooms. They disarmed us and stripped us of our best medical supplies. We fought our way out in a chaotic scramble. The van's tires shot out as we fled. In the confusion, Ivan managed to grab a single piece of their gear, a walkie-talkie that had fallen to the floor. We ran into the woods with nothing but our lives and the clothes on our backs. As we huddled behind a rock outcropping, bleeding and defeated, Wes looked at me. My hope had evaporated, replaced by the bitter taste of failure. "Lesson 4, Doctor," he said, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. "There are no civilians." The group's spirit broke after that. Ivan no longer looked to me for direction. His gaze went to Wes, whose predictions had all proven true. My authority was gone. Tony clutched the damaged walkie-talkie, holding it to his ear. He claimed the static was a new message, that the men in Beacon were signal interference he had been sent to overcome. We were no longer a group of survivors. We were a collection of broken people, led in name only by a man who had been wrong about everything. The Beacon Holdfast started hunting us through the woods. They knew we were a threat who knew the location of their base. Our journey was no longer a desperate flight toward Ithaca. It was a desperate flight from an enemy that was human, organized, and relentless. They cornered us near a river. A bullet tore through Ivan's leg, snapping the bone. He collapsed with a grunt of pain, unable to move. We were outmanned, pinned down behind a screen of thin trees. I had to prove I could still lead, that I could save us without becoming a monster. I devised a plan to create a diversion, to draw some of them away while the rest of us carried Ivan to safety. It was a complex plan, a noble plan. It relied on our enemies behaving in a predictable, rational way. The plan failed instantly. The Holdfast leader ignored our diversion. He was a sadist who wanted to watch us die. He stepped out from behind a tree to take a clear shot at Ivan. In that moment of complete failure, I knew my way of thinking was extinct. Wes acted. He did not consult me. He grabbed the walkie-talkie from Tony's hands, shoved it against Tony's mouth, and hissed, "Scream. The white noise demands it." Tony let out a raw, piercing shriek into the device, broadcasting pure noise for miles in every direction. The sound was a dinner bell. From the trees all around us, the infected began to emerge, drawn by the sudden broadcast. The holdfast patrol turned from us to face the new threat, their faces masks of shock. They were swarmed, their own screams drowned out by the gnashing and tearing of the horde. I watched in frozen horror as my failed plan was saved by an act of weaponized chaos. Ivan was safe, but the last piece of Dr. Dixon died with the screams of our enemies. We took shelter in a cold, damp culvert under a road. The air smelled of wet concrete and decay. I listened to Ivan's ragged, pained breathing and Tony's soft whispering to the static from the walkie-talkie. My morality had been a liability, a weakness that had almost gotten us all killed. Wes's lessons played over in my mind. Triage. Assets. Tools. There are no civilians. To reach my family, to survive this new world, I could not be a doctor. I could not be a good man. I had to become something else. The question was no longer if I would embrace his philosophy, but how I could use it better than he could. I had overheard the Holdfast patrol talking before the attack. Their main base was a hydroelectric dam, a fortress with its own power and a source of fresh water. A fortress we needed. I crawled out of the culvert into the dimming light. The others watched me. I took control of the group again, not with an appeal to hope, but with a cold logic that made even Wes raise his eyebrows. I laid out a plan to take the dam. We would not attack it with force. We would use psychological warfare, turning their paranoid defenses into a weapon against them. I assigned them their roles. Ivan's paranoia would make him the perfect scout to observe their routines. Tony's obsession with electronics would be used to hijack their communications. Wes's talent for seeing weakness would be used to build a psychological profile of their leader. I was not just following Wes's lessons anymore. I was composing my own brutal symphony. I looked at the 3 broken men who were now my weapons, and I knew the doctor was gone. The therapy was complete. "Tell him his leader thinks he's a coward," I said to Wes. We crouched behind a low concrete wall overlooking the service entrance to the dam, the night air cold against my face. A single light burned over a steel door. Wes held the walkie-talkie, his finger resting beside the transmit button, and his dark eyes were fixed on me with an unnerving stillness. He was a weapon I was learning to aim. Ivan had returned an hour ago from his reconnaissance, his report delivered in low, clipped sentences. He had mapped their patrol routes and identified their second-in-command, a man named Marcus who carried himself with a resentment that was easy to read even from a distance. That was the fracture point. For 2 days, Tony had been our ghost, using the walkie-talkie to broadcast whispers and the faint sound of dragging feet across their frequency, just enough to seed their paranoia. He mimicked the voice of a patrolman who had gone missing a week ago, a detail Ivan had also supplied. The holdfast was a sealed container, and I was increasing the pressure inside. Now it was time to crack it. I gave Wes the words, a simple script designed to prey on Marcus's ambition and his leader's arrogance. The message was that the leader, a former sheriff named Cole, was hoarding the best medical supplies and planning to purge the weaker members after the next supply run. It was a lie, but it was a lie built on the truth of their situation. Wes did not just repeat my words. He delivered them in a calm, conspiratorial tone, a voice of reason cutting through the static Tony had created. He made the lie sound like a shared secret, a warning from one survivor to another. Then he clicked off. We waited in the silence, listening to the distant rush of water through the turbines. The chaos started an hour later. It was not a single gunshot, but a sudden, panicked burst of automatic fire from deep within the structure. A man shouted something that was cut off by another shot. The fortress was consuming itself. We moved then, Ivan leading us through a storm drain that emptied near the base of the dam. His leg had healed enough to move without limping, the wound a tight, angry scar. Tony followed close behind me, his eyes clear and focused on the task I had given him, which was to disable their external security cameras from a junction box Ivan had located. He worked with a quiet intensity, his delusion now perfectly aligned with our purpose. We entered through a maintenance hatch, and the sound of the turbines became a powerful vibration that passed through the concrete floor into my bones. The fighting was sporadic now, contained to the upper levels. We found the leader, Cole, in the main control room. He was a large man with a bleeding wound in his shoulder, standing over the body of his second in command. He raised his rifle when he saw us, his face a mask of rage and betrayal. Ivan and Wes flanked me, their pistols up and ready. I held up a hand, telling them to wait. I walked toward Cole, my own weapon held loosely at my side. I did not see a soldier. I saw a patient. I saw a man whose rigid belief in his own authority had been his undoing. I began to speak to him, not as an enemy, but as a clinician delivering a terminal diagnosis. I pointed out how his need for absolute control had made him predictable, how his paranoia had isolated him from the very men he needed to trust. I described the psychological profile I had built of him from Ivan's observations, laying out his fears and his failures with a detached academic precision. His will to fight seemed to drain out of him with every word I spoke. The rifle in his hands lowered. His whole body sagged. He was no longer a threat, just a man broken by a world he could not comprehend. I raised my pistol and fired once. The shot was loud in the suddenly quiet room. I looked at the body on the floor, then at Ivan and Wes. They were not looking at Cole. They were looking at me. In their eyes, I saw the reflection of a predator they had not recognized before, something colder and more efficient than anything they had yet encountered. The top of the food chain had a new occupant. The dam was ours. It was a fortress of concrete and steel, a self-contained kingdom with power and clean water. After we had cleared the remaining bodies and secured the perimeter, I found new clothes for all of us. I took a dark work shirt and pants from a locker, shedding the last remnants of my institutional life. My face in the mirror was gaunt and hard, a thin white scar now running along my jaw, where a piece of shrapnel had grazed me during our escape from Beacon. My eyes were no longer exhausted. They were clear. I gathered the three of them in the main control room. The space was brightly lit, and the banks of monitors and control panels glowed with steady power. Through the thick glass wall, I could see the dark water churning below. It was time to establish order, my order. I told them that the necessary evils of our journey were behind us. I said we would build a new community here, based on structure, reason, and a code of conduct that would reclaim some of what we had lost. I looked directly at Wes. "Your therapy is over," I told him. "Your services are no longer required." Wes smiled. It was a slow, patient expression. He did not look at me. He turned his attention to Ivan and Tony. His voice was calm and analytical when he spoke, a perfect echo of my own tone when I had dismantled Cole. He began to recap our journey from Blackwood Peak, but he reframed every one of my hard decisions. He described my sacrifice of the nurse not as a leader's burden, but as a student's first successful test. He reminded Tony how I had sanctioned his madness, turning his illness into a tool for my own ends. Then he looked at Ivan. "When that nurse was bitten, the doctor hesitated," Wes said. "He would have sacrificed you, your chance to see your daughter again, for a principle. I would not." He turned back to face all of us. "I am a wolf, and have never pretended to be anything else," Wes said. "But him, he is a wolf who will tell you, with a straight face, that he is your shepherd. Who do you trust more?" The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady vibration of the turbines. Ivan looked at me, and I could see the thought of his daughter in his eyes. He made his choice, a choice for the man whose brutal pragmatism guaranteed he might one day get home. Tony trusted the man who had spoken the language of the white noise, the man who had given his madness a purpose. They did not move aggressively. They simply shifted their weight, a subtle realignment of loyalty. They stood with Wes. The coup was bloodless. I had been outmaneuvered, my victory turned into a weapon against me by the very student I thought I controlled. I now sit in a different room. It is clean and well lit. There is a bed, a desk, and a chair. I have food and fresh water. On the desk sits my old psychology textbook and the faded photograph of my wife and son. It is not a prison cell. It is an observation room. Through a thick pane of glass, I can watch Wes North directing Ivan and Tony as they methodically fortify their new kingdom. I am safe. I am cared for. I am the first and only patient in Wes's new world, a living monument to his mentor's final, perfect therapy session. He has cured me of my humanity, and I realize now that my sanity was the only thing that kept me free. My eyes are empty. I see the monster in the mirror of the glass, and I finally recognize myself.